Hey everyone, this is Imanee Mamalution. Welcome to the Mamalution podcast. I'm super excited to welcome a special guest onto the show today. This is someone that I met not too long ago as I was working with the New Earth Media team on the World Health Sovereignty Summit. Many of you have been following along with that, and if you haven't yet watched the summit, you can check it out at www.reclaimyourlives.com. So my special guest is Souvereign. We have been partnering for the last couple months, putting together this content and really delivering the voices of the most cutting edge and revolutionary people on the planet as we sort of break down and deconstruct this COVID pandemic. Souvereign's sort of been behind the scenes, and I'm really excited to bring his voice out more, and especially on my show, because so much of what you're about, Souvereign, is really related to the content through my book, which we're weaving through, which is The Absence Presence of Soil. So many of you are listening to those podcasts in between to be able to hear the content without having to read a book. So I'm very, very blessed, Souvereign, to welcome you to the show.
Yay, beautiful. It's great to be here.
So I have gotten to know you, and one of the things that really struck me when we first connected was just sort of this idea, well, we've both been on this path of building community, and this concept that you actually introduced to me was Syntropy and, you know, the permaculture principles, which is now moving into what we're calling forest agriculture. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Syntropic agroforestry.
Syntropic agroforestry. Yes.
Syntropic agroforestry is more or less the next succession that has come forth in the collective expression of the human being in our journey back into our reconnection with nature, where we are again part of an intelligent system, as opposed to this misnomer that we are the intelligent ones. Life, of course, in and of itself is intelligent and is the one metric that has the capacity to give birth and rise from within itself to its next expression, and is able to replicate and recreate and birth again and again and again itself. And Syntropic agroforestry is an in-depth study of becoming curious again how everything in life performs a function with purpose, and to just question what the function may be. And so a lot of the orientation is to really step out of judgment, step out of the mind of all the things that we think that we know, all the belief systems that we got programmed with on how reality operates, and becoming again students of nature. And in that, I've taken Syntropy into the biological ecosystem of the human form. And so within human ecology, applying a syntropic orientation has been just, wow, it's been a homecoming. And so I get excited and I feel alive when I'm invited to speak around these subjects, because they are intrinsic to our human experience. And so many people are sharing the relevancy to get back to the land, to reconnect with nature, to restore a lost relationship, or to rekindle that which we know from within is that nourishment and is nurturing us as we come back into harmony and balance and co-creation. And there's so much joy to be had when we become again open and willing to learn with and see with eyes unclouded to what nature actually in and of itself is doing, and what metric is upon which it is navigating. And that's just, it's an amazing homecoming. Yeah. And it's beautiful to talk about.
Yeah, and I love talking to you about it. I mean, that homecoming is really, for me, what I've been talking about for the last, few decades is about remembering, putting ourselves back together. And I don't think that this could be a more pertinent topic for what's happening on the planet right now, that as things are deconstructing, which is part of this process, right, that we break things down. And so much of what you talk about speaks to the programming or the enculturation, like these ideas, these stories, the things that we have. And that's really, what my book is about, is helping people, one, understand how we got here, and then how do we rewrite the stories? How do we put in the programs and the ideas that we actually want, that aren't being spoon-fed to us? So, as we talk about this remembering who we are, this process, how does that what you were just speaking to, like, how does that support what I really feel like we're trying to do, or we have to do as a human family right now?
Well, when I started in my journey in syntropic agroforestry, and I was rather confronted with my own mindset, how rigid it was and how protective it was of all the ideas, and actually how fractured and actually dismembered so many aspects of myself were. And when I started seeing that the principles that are witnessable and observable in nature, that they are also operating, they're operating throughout all of life. And humans, of course, are also life. And so those principles are operating in the same way. And then I became aware, which I already had quite a bit of awareness around prior, about the cult programming, about the cultural conditioning, the socially engineered matrix that we have all been so-called brought up in, but really brought down in. And as a student of the language of images already from a very young age, I've always found it intriguing to find the languaging and the syntax to speak in word sounds that would invocate certain images to become recognizable. And as I started exploring the syntropic orientations that I started familiarizing myself with, I became aware that the reason so much has been lost for me in my ability to relate from a natural place to life was simply because I didn't have the language. And word sounds had been either misconstrued or misinterpreted, or interpreted in a way that they actually didn't express their intrinsic meaning. And so remembering who we really are is a bringing together again all those members, all those parts of self that have become disassociated in our early childhood. We've all encountered many experiences because we were brought down in a Western cult, as I call it. And that's not to talk about it in a negative way. It's just to name it for what it is, out of a place of love and out of a place of acknowledgement. And because when we compare the latest succession, which I call the Western cult, that comes out of that imperialistic and that patriarchal sort of age of the glorification of mind, the making the intelligence and the intellect, what I call the overuse and the misuse of intelligence, the predominant orientation in how we navigate ourselves. When I started looking through all of that, I became really aware that this Western way of relating to reality, in comparison to more of an ancient indigenous perspective and way of relating to life, has got such fast differences to it. And it's almost like they're kind of like opposites if we openly start exploring how to be in a wholesome relationship with life, in a respectful and honoring relationship to, as it's often shared, with all our relations. And so when I delved into human ecology and started having a foundation in this syntropic, what I call Mindsong, because it's much more eloquent, it's much more of a living language, as opposed to a stagnant and what I would call a noun-based way of relating to what we see around us, or the concepts that we may have. I became aware that what's really happened for most of us is that we disassociated. When humans are not given the appropriate space and place that is safe, in which we then can express our feelings as we experience emotionally intense experiences. When those spaces and that environment isn't nurturing and open for that, in order to preserve the whole self, a part of self has to disassociate. We have an intense emotional experience. We are not able to, or are not allowed, or there's a suppression or a repression of the natural desire to express. When that's repressed, we disassociate, and this then becomes a member part of self that dismembers. And it's, for me, also beautiful that it was my first time when I heard this sentence, this beautiful concept of remembering who we really are, or who we truly are. It came from an indigenous heritage. When I first encountered it, I thought that it was very much about us being fifth-dimensional star beings and a whole range of beautiful spiritual elements and concepts and fantasies around that. But their wording was so accurate, because to remember who we really are is to bring back together all those parts of self that got dismembered by the exposure to
that controlled based narrative that you talk about. I mean, it is putting ourselves back together, literally. Yeah. The fragmented parts of ourselves, which it's been disoriented, because I love the way you talk about that being the Western culture. And I love when we've had many conversations about language, right? Because I believe words are so important, and we're creating a new love language. We talked about that before, and the words that have been deleted from language and rediscovering syntax. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Well, when I really got it, that Syntropy is the study of nature, and I applied it onto human ecology, onto myself, onto human nature. I started really being openly curious to remember what it constitutes to be a naturalized human being, to navigate in a natural frequency, to have my thought frequencies be of a natural orientation. And that's something in the process of remembering our human nature, we quite easily have this intrinsic inner knowing whether our thoughts or our feelings or expressions or actions are actually natural or not. And to have that as a measuring ground to measure our personal neurochemical activity to, but also how we move forward into the world around us, has been really, really significant. And in my exploration of that, of human nature, I discovered that we are feeling-based creatures. We are very social mammals, and we benefit most if we were to have a holistic and well-functioning culture that I call the human family of love, that we intrinsically actually are, and what we're all wired for. We're not wired for fear or hatred or war. We're all wired for love. When I looked at that, I discovered that feeling-based relating is the metric. And by entering into that, we are bound, when we speak on behalf of our feelings, we are bound to enter into an experience-based way of relating, which reconstitutes for us, if we start practicing it, a living language. Because feelings are emotion, is energy in motion. And where I've come from in my upbringing and navigation across the globe, I've mostly navigated any of my relating out of things that I thought, ideas, concepts, and I would often say, I think. And in my pursuit of reclaiming self-sovereignty, which later I come to understand that it wasn't something to reclaim, it was just something to return to, I discovered that the most sovereign that I can be, if I favor my feelings and relate for my feelings with anybody over any of my thoughts. And the reason for that is what feeling-based relating does, and the syntax that naturally comes with that, it stops debate, it stops arguments, it stops any sort of mental conflicts, because when you say I think this, well, then I could say, well, I think this. But when I say I feel, well, who's to argue with somebody's feeling? Because that's an intrinsic experience coming from within the cells. And to argue with somebody to say, well, you can't feel like that, but I am feeling like that. And what I found is that it's a very disarming way of relating with myself, because it's not just relating from my feelings with others, but also relating with my own feelings that I'm feeling, and having a relationship with that, which has been quite terrifying.
And don't you think so many people are just so out of touch with their feelings, not even knowing what they feel? And I mean, how is this playing out? Because, you know, what you're talking about, like as mammals, as you call us, he's and she's, we require this human connection, this, you know, ability to relate and express our feelings in this current COVID pandemic, I mean, that we're navigating through. I think this is so critical that we're relearning and remembering and coming back to this. Don't you feel that this is part of the journey, the hero's journey that you talk about, that this is what we are to learn right now, is how to just rewrite this language, like the living language. I mean, the ways that we speak to each other. If people were speaking from a feeling place and not a thinking place, and I'm just personally going in my mind how I can apply that in my own life, even, you know, because there's a lot of challenging conversations going on the planet right now. There's a lot of divisiveness. There's a lot of duality. How can we apply this new metric in our lives right now with the current crisis?
Well, when we speak from our feelings, and there's a lot to this. When I started re-enabling my nature, I started reconnecting with a whole series of natural comprehensions that were actually quite profoundly new to me, and yet they were really nothing new, because I was able to embrace them simply because they were based on a natural way of relating to life. And these natural comprehensions spoke actually a lot around what it is to navigate myself as a human being in a natural way. And one of the things that I started actively training myself in is my capacity to receive. And when we start relating from our feelings, it's very relevant in human ecology that others are there to just simply receive us. Feelings don't need to be countered. We don't need to be given solution. We certainly don't need to be fixed, because we're not talking about our problems. We're talking about our feelings. And what is the beautiful thing is that when our feelings are fully expressed and then they are received without a counter thought or a solution of some sort, they're just being thanked for being real. Most often there is a very natural form of relief, a feeling of like, wow, I've really been heard. I've really been received in that way. And that is something that I see is really beneficial during this time, for many to train themselves in their capacity to receive, because nobody's ever navigated any of this. So nobody really has any real solutions. And the real solutions are more found in the innate and the intrinsic ways that we relate to one another, from love, from a peaceful ability to just be a witness and to just listen to what's alive and what is feeling to be real for another human being. And this takes training. This is something that I have endeavored and committed myself to for many years, and that training remains active because there's so many humans that are doing it traditionally. They're still so stuck in that mindset, and it's all based on trauma. It's all based on unresolved emotional imprinting, because when we were young, it wasn't safe to express our feelings. So how can we all of a sudden assume that now it is going to be safe when we have all those years of programming that have stopped us actually from being vulnerable, being open, and being in touch with our own feelings? But that is the journey back home. And what greater time to embark on that journey consciously with a roadmap and a legend, where they become available. And I have mapped out quite a beautiful metric of the internal landscape of the human biological form. And I feel really good about sharing that with anybody that will be interested to hear about that at maybe another point. But what a great time to be here when there's so much tumultuous energy and there's so much coming to the surface and there's so much fear becoming stirred. And that's where we're then given an opportunity, and a real hero's journey in that sort of opens up for the collective. How do you navigate these times? Do you operate out of a space of reactivism, fear-based, control-based, trying to stay safe and trying to be just mitigating situations? Or are we able to come home to a center point of self, where we are not just trying to protect ourselves from external situations that ultimately only are happening in our own brains? Like, none of it is actually happening really directly in many of the people that will be listening to this. And I'm sure that some of you may have had some intense experiences and direct confrontations over the past months. My experience has been is that most of the chaos that I've observed has all been through social media. It's all been online, and I've all just been witnessing and observing it. And in that, being able to witness and observe my own thoughts, my own reactions, my own fear-based narratives, and then questioning, do I want to do it like that? Because is it resolving anything? And that's the beautiful thing about both remembering and reintegrating aspects of self, is that the unresolved will remain unresolved until it's properly resolved. And so this time is a huge opportunity for people to feel all their triggers, all their emotional reactions. And the question for each would be, do you feel comfortable with how you're feeling in that process? Because ultimately it is a choice to keep doing it like that, exactly like, because it's not necessarily fixing anything. It's just what I call, if you're not resolving, you're coping. And
people have been coping for a really long time, right? I mean, this is the perfect time for mastery on the planet. If you can't pick a better set of circumstances to navigate through this, you brought up so many good points, Sovereign. It's the invitation right now, I think, from the planet. One thing I keep hearing from everyone is that this feeling of everything is being deconstructed and coming to the light. I mean, we see that with the exposure to what's really going on, the cover-up with COVID, and even the recent Black Lives Matter and the rioting here in the United States. I know you're in Bali right now. But it's like everything that's been kind of not revealed and hidden and dark is like getting exposed to the light. But it's really because people weren't really seeing it and were just kind of in that coping and not feeling it. But there's a lot of information coming out right now. And I imagine people do have a choice. They can continue to go down the path and not see it and just cope, or they can take this opportunity to really do some introspection, look at their lives, and to not just remember, but even change their own syntax around that, or what we call this, the narrative. Everybody's talking about what the narratives, but also you talk a lot about, we've shared it as the new earth metric. I mean, this new earth that we're co-creating, and this is a creation process. And that's so much, the creation energy is so important. There's so many things that you said too, in that also being able to receive. I talk about that a lot. Speak to this new metric that we are all co-creating right now.
Well, I like the sound new, of course.
But it's not, right?
What we are able to restore for ourselves and within our communities is simply the original blueprint, is human nature, is what we intrinsically are wired for. And so it's much more returning to our original innocence, and in that lies the mastery. And in that lies also the Master Navigator that we came here to be and are given an opportunity to return to. And that may seem like a little bit of inverted logic, because we are so programmed to look for progress and ways forward, and this is not how we want to do it, so we got to create a new way of doing it. But when we study human ecology, and I study radical human ecology, because the current human ecology that we ended up in this Western cult is a very entropic ecology. It is a control-based one. It's a fear-based one. It's a lack and scarcity-based one. And there's a lot of concepts and ideas strung in amongst all of that have actually no serious basis in reality, in living reality. Syntropy is a word to basically describe the nature of life, which is wired for abundance. And here we are living in a Western created matrix that only really thrives when we make scarcity and lack become intensified, so the price of things can be increased. This has been the reason that the economy has been shaped and formed in the way that it has been, and how the powers that be have been in control of the economic framework in such a profound way. It's because artificial lack and artificial scarcity has been installed and has been created, and actually in life, in nature, that doesn't exist. And so the New Earth metric is about, for me, really returning back to a natural way of orientating ourselves from a self-loving place, where radical self-acceptance and radical self-love needs to become a committed choice point to enter into, because we have, through all of our conditioning, lost so much of our innate ability to be loving and kind to ourselves. Instead, we're still stuck with the imprints of what I call the primary shaming. We're dealing with guilt. We're dealing with all these twisted and inverted emotional patternings within ourselves that continuously are seeking ways out to become revealed and to become healed. And so when I see the New Earth metric, and I love the word metric because my grandmother's really brought that home for me. When I was brought up about 7 years ago, that started properly. That was by my grandmother's Waitaha in Aotearoa. And that's been a beautiful, beautiful journey, because the Waitaha people have held on to the original covenant, the original Santeki, the agreement with life. And as a nation of peace, they have maintained and still are sharing through their writings so beautifully how a peoples was living in an entirely syntropic orientation with life. And so that is the New Earth metric that I lean myself towards. And that's not because it's an ancient one. It's simply because it's an original one. It's not one that got tainted, distorted, altered, changed for the benefit of only a fair few, and in that the suppression of the masses.
How did you find your way to that, Souvereign? I haven't heard that story yet.
I have had I feel that for most human beings, the subconscious, based on our programming, is always wanting to create and attract into our reality circumstances and situations that would allow us an opportunity to go on an adventure. Because when we go on an adventure, we can discover more about ourselves. And that's what I call the hero's journey. And there was something so resonating when I already, as a teenager, there was this awareness around Atlantis and this olden times. And there was such an innate attraction to what was archetypally within that for me. And then I discovered Lemuria, which was even more ancient and carried more memory that is also stored in the collective. And on my journey to research and exploration on the web, when there wasn't all that much around, I came in contact with these Waitaha people. And that had to do with the organization that I run at the time, Parapachamama Spirit of Earth. I've supported many global elder gatherings, which was, of course, part of my hero's journey of returning home to self. Everything that I was putting out to thousands and thousands of people on the mailing list, I realized in retrospect that I was just writing emails to myself. Mm-hmm. I was just telling all these people what I actually wanted to accomplish within. And it wasn't until I actually facilitated the Waitaha people every 50 years would gather in Aotearoa, and they have been there before the Maoris settled the land. So you could consider them the original peoples of Aotearoa. And when every 50 years they would gather, and what Waitaha means water carrier. And so they would discuss the state of the waters together to measure the waters in the universe. And so their cosmology, their entire way of relating to life is one of the most expanded and expansive teachings and life ways that I've ever connected with. And I came into the position to organize for the first time in their entire existence as a peoples, and they go back about 52,000 years, all the way back to the stars. But for the first time, they opened this gathering up to the Western world, and I found myself to be the person that was asked to facilitate the organization of bringing the Western world into their sacred circle and discuss the states of the water. And that's where through that process of just the practical navigation of all of that, I had the fortunate opportunity to be embraced by these beautiful grandmothers and to be met prior with some of the most amazing she's that I have ever encountered. And it was beautiful because it was a homecoming to love. It was a homecoming to her, to woman, to mother, in ways that, obviously I had missed during my childhood. And so a tremendous amount of healing started happening for me when the unconditional love, that is not something that they kind of do as we see that you could use that. They live this. They are just simply out of this fractured mentality, and they are in a waypoint of being within themselves that truly they are master navigators, because to have navigated as a peoples that has been, they only stepped out of silence in the late 80s because Halley's Comet flew over, and that was their signpost to bring everything that they had protected by stepping into the shadows and by putting everything into silence about who they are and what their life teachings were and are. And they brought all of that back out. And there's some beautiful books available around that called The Whispers of Waitaha, which are all the grandmother relationings and sharings, as I call them. And then there's Song of Waitaha, which is all the grandfather stories of how they got to where they are still based. And they are Lemurian people. And so, there's a little bit there around
incredible
the original New Earth metric. And to add to that, initially when I read their works and I reconnected with this profoundly beautiful, resonant Mindsong, I thought, wow, these were the first permaculturists on planet Earth. They really got it. And then I came into Syntropic agroforestry and I realized, oh my goodness, they understood Syntropy more deeply than anybody that I've ever heard speaking about it, because they speak so eloquently of the study of the patterns of the universe. which is study of the patterns of nature. And so it all interlinked for me.
Wow, it makes so much sense. So, no, that sounds, I can't wait to read those books. I know I feel like I'm downloading just all of this vicariously through you and our conversations. And it's been such a joy to work together with you, because, you know, as we put this work out into the world, or whatever we're calling this body of, I think we're sort of collecting information and people and all of this, and we are creating this new metric. But the process that we've been on in during that time, I think, has just been as equally important. And I always believe that we're templating out in the world what's possible. So for, you know, in the world of relationships, what's possible and how we're relating as men and women, as people right now with very different opinions about what's even happening on the planet. And so I think if we keep coming back, that this is cyclical, there are patterns in even what we're supposed to be learning right now, even just if we look at history, but there's something very significant. I do think we're at a moment of great awakening. So it's interesting that they've started revealing their information, and a lot of these indigenous cultures are speaking out, and we've tried to bring their voices through some of these, you know, the most luminary voices on the planet. And this fits into that equation. You know, also so much of the conversation, Sovereign, has been around freedom and sovereignty. And, you know, when we return to that, when we restore that, I think you and I have talked about, like, people really don't even know what sovereignty means. And so we don't even have a context with how to relate in it. So as we're practicing this of, you know, this new syntax, this new language, this new way of being, and right now we need a lot of practice. I mean, we don't, you know, I remember 20 years ago talking about building community, and a lot of these things were ideas, and now we have to sort of put these things into practice. But that requires actually showing up and practicing and doing it, not just thinking it, but being it. So, and one of the other parts of that was that what we're used to doing is being in this counter position of fighting. And I love one of the things that you had said was, we're not fighting, we're dissolving.
The only way, so just to put a little bit of context onto this, about 2.5 years ago, my grandmothers of Waita asked me to initiate the bringing back to the forefront the Wananga of love. And Wananga is a Maori word for University of Greater Learning. And in that, all this languaging about remembering who we truly are and really going into that internal landscape of what's actually all still stuck, that's simply inhibiting us from living all those things that we so much actually desire, and the peace and the harmony and the abundance and the thrivality that we could all be co-creating together by communities coming together. And so I've been introduced to so many teachings that are quite profound, have been experienced as quite profound. And I took it as my own training that before I take this out into the world in a bigger way, I have to have come home to self wholly. And so that has been my return to self-sovereignty that, as I said initially, I thought I could reclaim it, but you can't reclaim something that is already actually yours, and all that happened is you got dislodged out of it. And whatever sits in the way of actually being that is just unresolved emotional imprinting. And so I've really rediscovered a beautiful map of these sort of primary imprints, and there's only 5 of them that really withhold people from coming back to love, coming back to self. And in that, because I'm always aware that there's also men listening, what I found that as a man, I'm able to shine so much more, and I'm able to feel so much more resilient and whole by having taken that journey in the return to the feminine and really restoring that internal relationship with the feminine. And so in that way, because the Waitaha people are also a matriarchal nation, and so their metric is not patriarchal at all. They are a matriarchally organized peoples. And that has a lot to say about the feminine nature of life. And not to say that there's this divide between the masculine and the feminine, but we can all see what the patriarchal matrix has sort of delivered over the past couple of thousand years, and who really took the brunt of that glorification of the masculine. And what it really was, when we look at what all occurred, it was all the insecurities, it was all the fears, and it was all the instability within men that made that suppression over the feminine become such a profoundly crazy expression. And when I think now about the restoration of wholesome, thriving communities, and when I think about what is involved in that, it's a return to self-sovereignty by simply remembering that that's who we all are in and of ourselves naturally, and that only love can actually bring us back there. And that's where I then speak about a commitment, a willful commitment to radical self-love, because there's a lot that we've abdicated and that we've denied. And in relationship to that, because what I've walked is not only a return to love, but also a real restoration of the will, which is an intrinsic part of the human expressive form of sovereignty. And that is, for a lot of women, something that they have a challenging time with, and most humans have a really challenging time with just freely expressing their will, because what it means is that you just freely say what it is that you want. But because we have been rejected on the freedom of expression of our will, many of us carry this imprint, feel safe to just say what we want. And then what some people do, they go in this overtone and they sort of make it sound that you can't even argue with what they want because of the intonation. And so it's about coming back to peace and coming back to love and coming back to peace from within, where the will can just be this very playful space almost, where it's either yay or nay. That's the truth of the feeling. It's either a yes or a no, but it doesn't have to be a strong yes or a strong no. It's just like, nay, that doesn't feel to be what I want to do, or yay, I feel willing. And in this languaging around reclaiming sovereignty, or returning to becoming more sovereign within ourselves, more whole, more reconnected, more self-assured, more at ease and more at peace, the will is an intrinsic component. And I can speak to that at length, because when we start reincorporating willing and willingness into our syntax and languaging, we are speaking to an intrinsic part of us that hasn't actually been cultured, that hasn't been asked to participate, that has actually been abdicated. But our will is the defining, it's like in our navigational instruments that we have, our will is sort of that needle that either goes to yay or to nay. But when that instrument is broken, we don't feel safe to articulate that our needle is going towards nay, or our needle is going towards a yay. And in that, we don't feel comfortable in our ability to express our will. And this has a lot to do with the English language, because the will is most often used by means of talking on behalf of other people's will. You can say, oh, you will go there and then you will do this. And you can say, I will do this and I will do that. But that places the will into the future. But the will only is an active, measurable feeling in the present moment. And I discovered the relevancy of the will because I grew up in a place called the Netherlands. And when we ask a child in Dutch, do you want this? We actually ask the child, do you will this? And then I became very intrigued. Why is this word will so removed out of the English language? And why is it placed in the future? And why can you speak on behalf of somebody else's will when we actually know that the will is the most significant document that anybody can ever write? And on top of that, the expression of government is the representation of the will of the people. And so when I started delving into this, and I wrote extensively about this for my own return to freedom, I really started actively incorporating my expression on behalf of my will, which took real training, because there was a lot of fear around saying actually what I am willing to do and what I'm not willing to do. And now, coming from that place of feeling-based relating, I can just put that word, I feel willing, and that just allows me to rest back into the safety of my cells and the safety of myself, that my feelings are totally real and they're totally natural and they are my truth. And so...
Wow, it's like so simple, but so potent. I mean, we hadn't talked about that, but that makes so much sense. This idea of will and how it's used in the English language and these wills, and to bring it back to like the current conversation. What are we willing right now? I mean, there's a lot of powerlessness. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of, people not feeling very hopeful. So I think, one of the things I want to invite others to participate with us and continue this conversation, Souvereign, is through the summit. We're going to continue to be bringing in other seminal voices, but you and I are hosting a community conversation with anybody who wants to engage with us on, obviously on Zoom platform. I'm Zooming you in now to be on this podcast, but if people want to participate in that, that's the invitation on a weekly basis. So you can definitely reach out through the podcast and I'll give you the information. And that's also going to be, if you're on the mailing list for Reclaim Your Lives through the summit, you'll be able to access all the resources because there's a lot that we're downloading. We're closing out here, Souvereign. Any last comments that you want to share with the audience? I know you've said a lot and I know it's going to take people a minute to absorb this.
Yeah, I would encourage anybody listening to be willing, because this is the defining element in actually coming home. If you're not willing, you don't want it. And if you don't articulate your will, then you also don't want it. Because the will really works in creational terms, in manifestational terms, and ability to change reality and to change the outcome of our experiences. Our will is an intrinsic, quintessential component. And if you don't articulate that you're willing, you actually don't want to. When we say I'm not willing, well, that's okay, because that's a nice way of saying I'm not willing with that to associate or navigate or be in relationship or participate in that. But when we are talking, because there's a huge focus in everything that we see around ourselves, there's often a focus that is also very programmed of everything that we don't want. I hear a lot of people talking about what they all don't want, but you cannot identify what it is that you want by saying what you don't want. And it's very challenging for people to actually find the languaging of what it is that they actually do want. Without getting into these really sort of beautiful, etheric dreams. How do we manifest this new earth metric, this harmonious community, co-living journey that for the next generations, that our children's children are going to be bringing up their children in a human family of love, where the sovereignty of the baby in the womb is already recognized and acknowledged, and it's respected for that. And so in that I often speak about lotus birth and the relevancy of exploring the entire human journey again from a natural place, but particularly in closing to this, for people to be willing to be curious. If you've listened to all of this, to be willing to be curious to any of the judgments that may have come up, or any of the, that doesn't fit in my way of relating to life. I don't want to make it sound as anybody's world is little, but in order to be able to embody and enter into a new place of our reality that we are experiencing around ourselves, there is a willful requirement to be willfully committed to radical self-reflection, because our judgments are only ever our own. They don't necessarily say that much about the external world. They say more about our internal world. And so if any of the things that we talked about and the concepts that I have related around have brought up some questions or some slight judgments, just be curious with yourself. Well, what is that? Because I'm not here to profess or do any teachery type of sharing. I'm just speaking on behalf of my experience. And yet I am aware that a lot of what I speak around can be rather new and for some people even a little bit confronting, because when we really feel into where it is that we currently are and that we're not necessarily satisfied with what we've so-called manifested in our reality, the only way that that's going to change if we change the circumstances that are the preconditions that are alive within us, within our programming, within our way of relating to life. And so my encouragement would be is to be mindful of everything that you witness around yourself and to be willfully open to reflect on, are you judging? Are you casting judgments on your external reality? And is it really serving you? Because that's like pretty much sovereignty 101, is that a sovereign human being has the capacity to refrain from judgments and is only really curious and asks questions. And that is then the return to the original innocence, because that's what children do. They are in tune with that. It doesn't even have a name for them. They don't call themselves sovereign. The word sovereignty shouldn't actually, in true fact, not even have a word, because it's just simply who we naturally are. But that open curiosity is a prerequisite, and it requires willful participation on behalf of yourself, yourselves. And that can only be entered into when you actually proclaim that for yourself. Because when you do not express your will, you're also not, if you're not willing to, if you listen to all of this and you haven't said, I'm willing to actually take this in, this quintessential element of your being, that is the authority of self. The will governs also the entire cellular metric of the entire biological form. You can access any memory by willing access. You can change any neurological pattern by being willing. The will is the defining sort of authority, that is the flick switch, that if you are willing, the spiritual self is articulating its will, then it gives a direct instruction onto the field around itself. And so becoming willing is something that I would really encourage people to sit with and explore the syntax around it and explore for themselves how often they're not willing. And if they find themselves judgmental, if they feel willing to explore where it comes from within, because that is the biggest journey that we are here to take, is to restore wholeness from within, and applying our will in that process in conjunction with the womb. So I've just addressed the will part, but the womb part, the hara part, that womb connection is a whole other subject that would intrigue a lot of women to hear a man speak about, and I'm sure it would intrigue a lot of men, because if you truly as a man want to restore the wholeness of your sovereignty, in my experience, there is no possibility to accomplish that without a wholesome return to the womb and a restoration of that relationship with the womb field that we are actually walking in here on the earth. We are walking in a tremendously expansive womb field of creation. It's the creatrix itself. And that may sound a little bit esoteric or a little bit, out there. But what I've discovered about everything in the external world is it stands almost bleak in light of my experiences of my internal landscape, because that is where the transformation has truly taken place. And then the external reality starts just becoming so much more enjoyable and free and lovable and exciting. So willfulness.
Beautiful, Sovereign. I love it. I think that you've given people a lot to think about, and I really appreciate everyone tuning in and being willing to be here with us. And yes, we will have many more conversations diving into that womb talk, and I think there's even more after that. So if this is something that's intriguing you, you can join us. Just check it out on the Reclaim Your Lives platform, and if you send any messages through there, you're going to reach Sovereign, and he'd lovingly and gladly respond back to you, because that's something that he so enjoys doing. So that's the invitation, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you, Sovereign, for being you and sharing yourself and your words with us today.
Yeah, well, it's only natural.
Thanks, everyone.
Yay.
Yay.